Welcome to Interfaithing,
a podcast for and about Jewish and Christian interfaith families,
where we explore the question why families can embrace two faiths under one roof.
I'm Ari, the son of a rabbi with a degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I'm Anna, the daughter of a minister with a degree from the Union Theological Seminary. We were co-teachers together at the Interfaith community in New York.
And 1 year of working together led to 15 years of friendship and collaboration.
To find us sitting here today, embarking on a new project.
Whether you are part of an interfaith family,
or you're exploring and interested in how different faiths interact with one another,
this is the space for you.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And help us spread the Torah and gospel of interfaith wisdom far and wide.
And you'll also gain access to exclusive content like our holiday live stream events.
We hope you enjoy every episode.
Listen at your own pace.
Share with a friend.
And don't forget to subscribe.
This episode, we are unpacking the myth of, it will confuse the kids.
What's going to happen? They'll never know the difference between Jesus and Moses.
For a full introduction to this episode, please check out part 1. And now, let's get to part 2. Okay, are you ready for the next story?
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Why don't we go over to Sue?
We originally met Susan Katz-Miller, author of Being Both, Embracing Two Religions in One Interfaith Family, in Myth Number 2, Part 2. So you're Jews for Jesus, right?
We're going to hear another story from the conversation I had with Sue Katz-Miller. And as a reminder, which she will also explain through the story, Sue is an interfaith kid herself. She grew up with parents who come from two different faith backgrounds. So I asked her, what was it like? She is older than you and I, Ari, and so even generationally, like having this example of somebody who grew up with or came to have an interfaith identity in a different generation than perhaps where some of our families and audience members might find themselves today. But you're going to hear Sue speaking in her full confidence as an adult, having, lived as an interfaith kid for a long time.
Sounds good. Looking forward to it.
So I think that most, if not all, interfaith kids know from the very beginning that there's more than one religion in their family. It's not something you can really hide. You can give them a single religious label.
Mm-hmm.
You can give them a singular religious education. You can give them only one set of religious experiences. But you can't hide the fact that they've got probably a set of grandparents. Even if the parent has converted, you're in an extended interfaith family, because you're going to have a set of grandparents and probably aunts and uncles and cousins who have a different religious practice than the one that you've been given. So I think all interfaith kids are aware of this really from the beginning of being aware of having extended family. The only way around that would be if you brought them up in complete isolation from their extended family, which not that many people do.
Yeah.
So the question really becomes, how do you approach that with your children? How do you encourage them to think about it? And to what degree do you include extended family and holidays of the other religion and those sensory experiences that are so important for children, the smells and the sounds and the songs, the stories, all of that of both religious cultures.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, my parents chose one label for us and one religious education for us, but I had Christmas and Easter with my Christian cousins. So I had the smells and the sounds and the chocolate eggs and, a lot of very delightful stuff. It was not given any religious context because my parents were being very clear that we were being Jewish. So there wasn't any talk about the role of Jesus at Christmas or Easter. So I grew up intellectually ignorant of Christianity, but still having that sensory experience of Christian culture and those close bonds of affection with my extended Christian family. And I think that those things are formative for children, even more so than any intellectual part of it. And so that's why I feel like I knew I didn't have the language. Nobody was talking about being an interfaith kid. That was not something that anyone was really talking about. So it was later, really, as a young adult, that I became more of an activist in insisting on my right to claim connection to both religions. And that is something almost I feel like I have a birthright to do that. And I had to then go back and educate myself about Christianity because that had not been provided to me. And so that's been an interesting journey. Having to defend my Jewish identity to the Jewish community becomes really exhausting. And even though I still call myself Jewish, and in fact, I belong to my ancestral family Jewish community now, to the synagogue that my great-great-grandparents founded. So I am a card-carrying Jew, but when it came time to decide how to raise our children, I wanted to give them the gift of interfaith education that I knew that our public schools would not provide and that I did not have. And my husband actually had said he would be fine with raising our kids Jewish. But it was very hard for me to imagine sort of putting them through what I went through of feeling on the margins and having to defend myself. And they would be a generation removed. They only had one Jewish grandparent. And it was a grandfather, so the quote unquote wrong side from the traditional Jewish viewpoint is that the religion is passed down by the mother. So I've been dealing with that all my life. So for me, claiming an interfaith identity alongside the Jewish identity, which I still have, which I will always have, in part because my parents raised me that way, and in part because I find Judaism very compelling. But beside that, my interfaith identity has become, for me, something that's very empowering, something that's inspiring, something that I've spent the last 20 years working on, professionally. So I definitely wanted my children to be empowered by that claiming of the interfaith identity from the beginning.
So in listening to Sue, I love the richness in how she described, kind of what it's like to be a child experiencing any or either faith background that you would find yourself in, that the things that stay with us and that can be so emotionally resonant, even as adults, that can bring us back to certain moments are the smells, the sounds, the songs. And suddenly, you're back in a grandparent's house watching them prepare a meal or maybe like sitting through a service at a holiday celebration, like something like that, and how powerful those parts are. And I feel like even what you and I heard, Ari, when we were working with interfaith families with the IFC, like sometimes we would hear the parents talk in those ways, like they hadn't really thought long and hard about the traditions that they had come from. They had started taking things for granted. It had become a little bit more rote. And then when they were trying to share these things with their kids for the first times, and so they maybe tried to bake something that they had remembered from their past, like all those memories coming back to them, and so badly wanting to give their children a similar kind of emotional experience, some piece of it.
Right.
that would become a part of their spirit, become a part of their core. And, just to be able to hear Sue then describe what we were kind of just discussing, she had this curiosity, she had this willingness to want to explore more about both of her backgrounds, even though her parents made a choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And she went against that choice in certain respect.
Yeah. And even then herself becoming a parent and hearing how she talked about her husband was willing to kind of do the same thing that her parents had done, which was go with one. And ultimately they agreed as parents, like, not to do that, to again let their kids be open, to expose them
Right.
to more than just the one thing. And then she didn't speak to this, she was focused on herself, but her kids are making their own choices in their own lives.
Yeah. When we were talking to the kids, because of the timing, it was like the 7th grade was when we were teaching them, that one of the bigger questions that we were asking, or that they were asking, or the parents were asking in some way, was, okay, you've gotten all this education, which, for different podcasts, is up to 7th grade enough for religious education for anyone? Our answer is no, not. But let's just put it as kind of the standard that you get to that come of age ceremony, and that's the end of that kind of foundational period. So at the end of the foundational period, how do you identify yourself? How do you identify yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Are you Jewish? Are you Christian? Or are you interfaith?
Right.
And from what I recall, majority of the kids say, why do I have to choose? And I think the idea, like, why do I have to choose, is often viewed by detractors against this. Sorry about that.
Bless you.
Thank you. Saying, well, then that's a problem with the parents because they didn't allow them, they didn't choose for the kids, and therefore it's confusing, right? It's
right.
They don't know who they are. But as Sue astutely put it, that it doesn't matter what the parents decide about how to raise kids. All interfaith kids, in some ways, know that they are interfaith, regardless of the particular path that the parents choose. You are going to their homes for the sights and the smells of the different holidays. Every family has to make their own choice. And there's a lot of family drama with all this too, in terms of, which side of the family, or both sides of the family, do you connect with them or not? And that could be related to faith, that could not be related to faith. There's a whole lot of other stuff there. But assuming that you will have the experience of having both sides of the family a part of your family, you go to their house, you experience their lives, that will become a part of you. And when the kid said, I want to be interfaith, is saying, I accept the wholeness of my upbringing.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's amazing what kids do, is that they are these new formulations of humans that take different elements of their upbringing, hold them at the same time as going on their own journey and seeing where that goes. And I think that that's a very beautiful thing.
Yeah.
All right.
It really is. Yeah.
Excited to continue with our storytelling?
Ever as always.
Okay, so the next story comes from Yvette and Brett. We originally met Yvette Cam of the Interfaith Book Group in New York in part 1 of myth number 2. So you're Jews for Jesus, right? And this story, as it relates to the question of will kids be confused, has to do with the topic of, Dad, you can't control me anyways. So this is what they have to share on that.
I do 100% agree that it won't work. It's something that kind of has more pressure when you become a parent. It's 100% more because you want, again, I think we discussed this before, but I think you want your kid to be a good citizen, your offspring to be somebody, a good adult, somebody that is going to have the best intentions. That's what you want to raise your kid to aspire for, right? But at the end of the day, I just heard a parenthood podcast as well, and they were saying, that. You can't control me. And that's true. You can't control, it won't work. It won't work for anything in your kid's life. It cannot work for potty training. They can take a long time. You want them to be a doctor and then they ended up in clown university, which is fine. And it will be the same for religion. But the only thing that sometimes over generations or family members or grandparents, they just want to continue that line. But in our case, what we just want is our kids, or right now, our kid, to be a good person, to have good values, and as well to love. You know, God is all about love and Jesus is all about love. Why don't we just mix those loves and create something better out of it?
So that's Yvette sharing what she learned from a parenting podcast that I think is really important for what we're saying here.
Yeah.
Which is, no matter what we decide as parents, like our kids are going to have their own ideas. And so even if we think that we're being very clear about what we're teaching, even if we're instilling certain kinds of values, our kids are going to decide for themselves. And the question about why we're worried that we be confusing the kids, or to put it another way, the parental concern of confusing the kids is that we may not feel that we have the answer to be able to give to our kids that will allow them to be able to engage in interfaithing in a way that is true and authentic and would work for them, because we're trying to figure out what it's like for us, let alone for trying to figure it out for our kids. And I think that's part of the point that she was saying in regards to how the issue of interfaithing, the issue of can a family be able to find a way to embrace two faiths under one roof? Can that work when you start to have kids? Any hot take thoughts on that?
Well, I just appreciate so much what Yvette was pointing at in her statement of having to essentially like accept, to come to terms with that approach to parenting, which is I don't have total control. Yes, this little person is a part of me. They came from me, and I'm responsible for raising them and keeping them safe and instilling them with values and all the things that come along with being a parent. And yet in her voice, there was almost a sense of relief as she was sharing what she had learned from that other parenting podcast of hearing a child so succinctly but so innocently at the same time say, you can't control me.
Right. There's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
So you got to accept it.
Yeah. And I think even in some of our previous conversations, we've touched on this idea of control and how as human beings, like sometimes what we kind of trap ourselves in is trying to have control over topics and situations that ultimately we have no control over. And so that
Right.
tension naturally exists, and it shows up in so many different areas of our life.
Mm-hmm.
And I just really appreciate, as a non-parent myself, but as someone who has spent a lot
I
of
like that term,
time,
non-parent.
yeah.
Enjoy
child,
non-parenthood.
I know. Child-free. I mean, I don't know. Does any of it?
Whatever it might be.
But having spent a lot of time with and being in relationship with parents and their children, and so like journeying alongside a lot of people who are in the business of raising kids, I feel like that objectivity that I have is being reflected in what Yvette was saying, right? That
Okay.
sometimes when you're in the midst of it as a parent, like it's so understandable, it's natural to care so much about your kid that that control becomes smothering.
So are you saying that from a parental perspective, they believe that they're offering a form of care, but from the perspective of the child, that's a form of smothering.
Yes. Like, I definitely think that that happens in a lot of parent-child relationships. I was having a conversation with someone who's an adult now, reflecting on a value that their parent had instilled in them because their parent thought that it was very important, but this person didn't feel connected to that. And there's this
Right.
guilt on the part of the child for
Wow.
not doing what the parent had
The
wanted.
value.
Yeah,
Right.
the value that they had left with them and had encouraged in them. And it's even those experiences as adults to have to say, but it's my life.
Right.
And I
It's
can
my
still
life.
show you respect, parent,
Mm,
caregiver, etc.,
interesting.
for the care that was so obvious. Like, you cared enough to try to instill values into me.
Mm,
And I am a whole person now who gets to write my own story.
right. And you have to allow me to be able to do that.
Yes, that
So,
reciprocity.
so there's a story that I want to share from Tanakh, from the Bible. Comes from Judges chapter 14, which is the story of Samson. Because
Mhm.
Samson, I think, actually is very much related to this question around listening to your parents, the values your parents have. So, background before I begin with this story, because it's not just the story itself, but it's also about the rabbinic perspective on the story.
Let's go.
So, there are many characters in Torah who marry somebody of a different, if you want to call it faith background, although that's a little anachronistic, of a different cultural background at the very least. You have Joseph marrying Asenat, who is an Egyptian, and you have Moses marrying Zipporah, who's a Midianite. Rabbis from future generations looked at these stories and said, I'm not sure we want our forefathers, our leaders, to be viewed as ones who married people from a different background. And so they interpreted these stories in a way that suggested that Asenat, Zipporah, or any other spouse of one of the main characters, what the rabbi said is that these folks converted to Judaism, or the forerunner of Judaism, Israelite religion. Come to the story of Samson. And with Samson, that interpretation is actually impossible by virtue of the text itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because Samson goes, this is chapter 14, verse 1. One Samson went down to Timnah, and while in Timnah, he noticed a certain young Philistine woman. On his return, he told his father and mother, I noticed one of the Philistine women in Timnah. Please get her for me as a wife. Okay, so very clear. This person is a Philistine. Eventually, we know it's Delilah, and that Samson wants to have her as a bride, wants to take her as a bride, and says to his father, please go down and do this for me, because the job of a parent, especially of a father, is to find a bride for your son. So from there, the text, or I should say, from there, the rabbis could theoretically say, well, Delilah came and she became converted to Israelite religion. But the very next verse says, his father and mother said to him, is there no one among the daughters of your own kindred and among all our people that you must go and take a wife from the uncircumcised Philistines? Right? It's right there. His parents being like, you obviously don't have the value of, well, we're trying to pass down to you and you're doing this. I mean, come on. Right?
Right. And there's
That's
no
just
follow-up conversation or statement in the text to then say, and so therefore Samson had a conversation and she agreed to become Jewish with a
right.
mikvah. Like, that doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen at all. And in fact, what happens next in the very same verse, it says, but Samson answered his father, get me that one, for she is the one that pleases me. Now, there's a lot of stuff there having to do with gender dynamics that we could talk about in another time. But I think that at this point in time, what's fascinating to me about this story is that it makes it very crystal clear to the point that the rabbis can't really get out of it to say that Samson took Delilah, a certain young Philistine woman, as a wife. So what does that mean? I think in the context of what Yvette is saying is like, you can't control your kids. They're going to do what they want to do. But then there is the question about Samson as a leader of Israel, because he took special vows to be a Nazirite. A Nazirite is someone who goes above and beyond their religious obligation to follow God and say, I want to be more faithful to God, so I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to abstain from Y, X, and P,
Yeah.
whatever it may be. And so the question that is asked of the rabbis is not just about the fact that he took a Philistine woman as a wife, but how could a Nazirite, how could someone who promised themselves to God in that way, how could they do it? And so there's a commentator by the name of Abravanel, who's a medieval commentator on Torah and on the Bible in general. And he said, how could a judge of Israel marry a daughter of the Philistines? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. And so then Abravanel, in his way of explaining what he thinks Samson might be doing, says, it seems at the conclusion of Samson's thinking on the matter of his Nazirite requirements, only obligated to abide by the specific requirements that the angel placed upon him. Meaning, you could be faithful to God in a certain way, but it doesn't mean you have to be faithful in all of the ways that we would normally think that you would have to do so. So what Abravanel is doing is he is trying to save Samson from committing something that is considered to be wrong by explaining that in Samson's mind, he did not think he was doing something wrong. And that, I think, is one of the other pieces to this question of, Dad, you can't control me. Parents have a certain value system that we place upon our children. And to all you non-parents and child-free ones out there, you are able to live your life fully. And then one day, if you decide to have children, you're going to see, okay, this is the life that I lived, and what pieces of it am I going to pass along, and what pieces are important for me. But there has to be the humility to know that you can't pass along everything. You have to have the humility to know that children are going to make their own choices. And the question that we have to ask of ourselves is, what are the choices that will fill us with a sense of greater connection to God, to one another, will fill us with love? And can we trust kids to say, Dad, Mom, I understand what's important here. You've taught me well, but now let me live my life.
Yeah. And you just reminded me, in talking about that, of a personal story that I haven't considered, I haven't thought of in many years. It's related to my own exploration and my own faith journey, if you
I can't
will,
wait to
and
hear.
like how I needed to work out some stuff and go through some things related to how I identified as a Christian, with the word Christian, with Christianity, organized religion. And my father and my mother, but my father, like professionally as a pastor, and then we as a family, having lived as a pastor's family, rooted in the church. And I actually was able to have a conversation with them where my dad admitted to me, he was like, when you were in the middle of that exploration, and this is connected to my college years. And so part of it was taking like a survey of religions course, where the common structure in those courses, if you're in a semester system, that you're going to spend like 2 or 3 weeks focused on fill in the blank world's religion or wisdom tradition, and you get immersed in that to get exposure to a survey of the world's religions, and then you move on. And so every 2 weeks I was calling home with this enthusiasm of these other options that I was discovering. And I think by design, because college was in Arkansas, it had a relationship with the Methodist Church in Arkansas. And so there was a fairly safe assumption that the overwhelming majority of students at this college had grown up with a Christian background. And I think it was intentional that our professor put Christianity at the end, not because he was trying to make a statement like, and we've saved the best for last, but because that's what everybody was already familiar with. And so wanting to put Christianity at the end after having spent the rest of the semester learning about and from these other traditions to then like kind of put Christianity in a different light. So if
Right.
you were having assumptions, taking things for granted, it would make
Give
you
you a
question.
chance to kind of then sort of
Yeah,
compare what you've learned now to
exactly.
Thinking about the tradition that you had growing up and viewing it as an adult after going through this period of exploration.
Yes.
Okay.
And me personally had also been in a period of not wanting anything to do with my Christian background. There had been some pain moments through some of those years, especially in high school, and kind of feeling as a pastor's kid that I had both witnessed things that were said and done to my father that
Right.
didn't make me feel good, and that I myself had received that really made me think like, kind of, what is going on? I need to
Right.
question everything. And in my youth, it was, well, then I need to reject this. I want separation from it. I don't want to go to church. I want the freedom as a young adult to make a completely different decision. And then I wound up in this Survey of the World Religion course, and in connecting with my parents, especially my dad, I was speaking so enthusiastically about all of these other options.
Yeah.
And years later, mind you, we had a conversation and my dad brought that up. And he was like,
just in terms of years later, can you be more specific
oh,
about?
sorry. So college, that might have been freshman or sophomore year, I engaged with that class. And then fast forward a few years, like probably when I was in graduate school at that point. So I'm older, and I'm having a conversation at that time with my parents. And somehow that period of time, my exploration, the being in that class, trying on different things, came up. And my father admitted to me that he felt torn because on the one hand, it was making him very worried and in some ways very sad that I didn't seem to be interested, or that I could find happiness and joy and potentially consider shedding my Christian identity and take on something new. And yet what he also admitted was, but I hear the joy in your voice, and I knew how unhappy and how painful some of those experiences had been for you. And I couldn't deny you to go through that process. Right. So he was like, yes, I was scared, but at the end of the day, it was your life and your happiness that was at stake.
So what did you take away from that conversation in regards to, one, your relationship with your dad and your experience growing up as a pastor's kid, and two, your relationship with Christianity?
Well, it made me feel immense gratitude for the approach that not only my dad, my mother, both of my parents took, because getting back to Yvette's story and our conversation here about instilling values in your children, they could have tried to enforce control and inserted themselves into the situation. And I think rather than try to be in conflict and get their way and impose what they thought was best for me, that they let me figure it out on my own.
Yeah.
And they even described, and I share the sense that as far as my own faithfulness and where I ended up, as far as my identification with my Christian background and the term Christianity, they had to reflect on the strength of their own faith and say,
your parents had to reflect on their,
my parents had to reflect on kind of the strength of their own faithfulness and say, we have instilled incredible values in our daughter. And we trust that the Holy Spirit, that Jesus, that God, fill in the blank, will do the work.
Wow.
And it's beyond us.
That is such a beautiful and powerful story. And thank you, Anna, for sharing that with me and with all of our listeners, to hear more about where you're from, where you're coming from, and how this question is so important to you and to your own faith journey.
Well, thank you for reminding me of it.
We all should just thank Yvette and Samson.
Yes. And Samson. Yeah. Yes, exactly.
So thanks to that dude named Samson, judge of Israel, Nazarite, cool dude.
As I've heard so many times, especially from Southern Christian churches, look what God did.
God did just good here.
Look what God
just get
did.
here. All right. Well, Anna, thank you for your thoughts and for all of the different stories that we were able to bring in this episode. Always such a pleasure to learn with you, to talk with you, and looking forward to our next episode.
Yes. Until next time. And the kids are going to be all right.
Kids are going to be all right.
Thank you for listening to part 2 of episode 3. It'll confuse the kids.
We hope you learned and laughed with us.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And we want to thank our supporters and contributors, our families, and all of our featured storytellers.
We also want to give a special shout out to our composer and music producer, Pablo Langain.
Subscribe, share, leave a review, and send us a message. We would love to hear your feedback and to learn more of your stories.
Find us on any of your podcast platforms to subscribe, and you can also find us on interfaithingpod.com.
Like and follow us on Facebook and Instagram.
And if you really like what you hear, please consider supporting us financially at patreon.com/interfaithing.
So until we meet again, take care.
Stay curious.
And
keep
keep
interfaithing.